one hand and Zenos on the other. Then, later record keepers of the Nephite records followed the pattern set by Lehi and Jacob. In this manner, an Old World scribal tradition was transplanted to the New World, where traces of it might still be seen 2 millennia later. There was a scribal tradition, a lineage history scribal tradition, that John Sorensen has discovered in Mesoamerica also. Fun stuff, isn't it? So in conclusion, there appears to be very good evidence that the Book of Mormon contains elements which are congruent with what scholars of the Old Testament distinguish as the E-source, or the Elohistic source. To biblical scholars, this congruence could invite serious discussion and attention for the Book of Mormon for what it may reveal to them about the Old Testament sources. And to Latter-day Saints, the serious biblical scholarship ought to convince us to take better heed with our own scriptures, the Book of Mormon especially. Now, in Kevin Barney's article on his reflections on the documentary hypothesis, on page 74, he discusses this idea of the Book of Mormon itself, saying that the brass plates contain the 5 books of Moses. He says, according to 1 Nephi 5:11, they say the brass plates contain the 5 books of Moses. Now, Jan Jodl rejected the documentary hypothesis because of this one statement in the Book of Mormon. There were 5 books of Moses, not separate sources. Well, if the basic sources were all pre-exilic, we do not know in what form those sources existed prior to the redaction of those sources by the redactor. It may well be that there were 5 books of Moses, only in a somewhat different configuration than the 5 books of Moses as we know today. So that doesn't necessarily refute the documentary hypothesis. Although I admit this is a possibility, personally I think it's simpler to assume that the text referred to books of Moses, taking the number 5 as a translator's gloss. In other words, that's just Joseph Smith saying 5 books of Moses, perhaps. 1 Nephi 19:23 refers to the books of Moses on the brass plates without the number 5, which supports this possibility. In fact, the first edition, the 1830 edition of the Book of Moses of the Book of Mormon has the Book of Moses. This even suggests that the plural books in 1 Nephi 15:11 may be a gloss based on the prophet Joseph's assumptions and expectations. 1 Nephi 22:20 and Helaman 8:13 simply refer ambiguously to the words of Moses. So the idea that there are 5 books of Moses, you've got to be a little careful there, because it also just describes books of Moses. It also just describes words of Moses. So that doesn't necessarily refute the documentary hypothesis. Now, the Book of Mormon does contain numerous references to the law of Moses, but that usage, the Torat Moshe, was already attested in the scriptures to which Lehi would have had access anyway. Alma 13 contains a version of the 10 Commandments that is close but not identical to Exodus 20. Well, scholars have theorized that there was an original text of the commandments deriving from E that was elaborated on by P in Exodus 20 and by D in Deuteronomy 5. I'm going to take a brief moment and eat some of my taquitos for lunch, and then I'll return to making more of these videos. My stomach started rumbling, and that can be distracting. So, I'm going to eat lunch, and I'll be right back with more on this documentary hypothesis. Okay, now, when we discuss the idea of tight control over the translation of the Book of Mormon, one who insists on tight control over the Book of Mormon might say that Abinadi had access to a version of the commandments that was influenced by the P writer. One who follows for a loose control might say that Abinadi's text derived from E, which is consistent with John Sorensen's theory that I've elaborated to you, but that Joseph in general followed the form given in the King James Version at Exodus 20. since it sufficed for his purpose here. And this is B.H. Roberts' explanation for Joseph Smith's use of the King James Version in the Book of Mormon generally. Well, it is most significant, however, that this lengthy text crosses no seams between the sources. In other words, it doesn't cross from a J to an E source, or from E source to a P source, or a D source to an E source, or whatever. It is all in the same source. And he says, I'm not going to undertake a complete study of the uses of the various documentary sources in the Book of Mormon. It will suffice for me to offer one example of how the documentary hypothesis can help to make sense of something that we find in the Book of Mormon. Now, you know, Kevin Barney, he always finds insightful things like this, and this is one of the niftiest insights I've ever read. This is good. I love this. I suppose this impacts me more today because I just finished reading Friedman's text, Who Wrote the Bible, yesterday. So all of this junk is fresh on my mind. In 1 Nephi 17:29, the Book of Mormon, Nephi is lecturing his brothers on the importance of keeping the commandments of God. And he does this frequently. Because they follow the Jerusalem establishment, you see. They don't believe in this visionary, dreaming, scheming guy, Lehi and Nephi. Yea, here's what Nephi says to his brothers. He says, Yea, and ye also know that Moses, by his word, according to the word of God which was in him, smote the rock, and there came forth water, that the children of Israel might quench their thirst. Now this incident is told, he recalls the incident about Moses, and it is in completely positive terms. And certainly it's based on the E-text of Exodus 17 verse 6. And here's why we can say that. Because the P-text in Numbers 20 verses 1 through 13 gives the incident at the waters of Meribah a different spin. In this anti-Moses text, Moses fails to follow the Lord's instructions precisely by striking the rock rather than speaking to it. And he and Aaron seem to take the glory of the miracle to themselves. Here's what they say. They say, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Numbers chapter 20, verse 10. See, according to Numbers chapter 20, verse 12, this incident became the reason that the Lord refused to let Moses enter the promised land. It's a very negative approach to Moses. See, this is one of those doublets. One story tells it in a positive sense, the E source, because E emphasized the positive characteristics of Moses. And the other source, the P source, puts it negatively. Very interesting. The Book of Mormon, again, reflects the E source. Now, every Sunday school student is familiar with both the positive and negative accounts of Moses striking the rock. In fact, the 1981 LDS edition of the Book of Mormon cross-references both the Exodus 17:6 and Numbers 20:11. It says read them both. Yet Nephi and the Book of Mormon betray no knowledge whatsoever of the negative P tradition. I find this to be remarkable. And I take it as an indication that there may well be something to the documentary hypothesis. I love his analysis of this. I thought that was very insightful. And then he goes through several ideas on the Joseph Smith translation. And he discusses some of his reasons why he doesn't accept the documentary hypothesis fully 100%, neither do I. And quite frankly, I'll be honest with you, Kevin has explored some of the weaknesses and the strengths of the hypothesis, and I can't find anything to disagree with him on this. But he does ultimately accept the documentary hypothesis. And what I'm trying to get to is why. Oh, here we go. Okay, page 87.